to fail at curiosity, to not be curious about those things and about how they can enable you to do the work you do and to do it well, is to fail as a leader.
Today's guest is the Reverend Dr Kate Coleman. She's a trailblazer in leadership and faith. As the first Black woman accredited as a Baptist minister in the UK, she brings over 35 years of experience spanning the church, charity, volunteer, and business sectors. She's the founder of Next Leadership, working with organizations, including the UN, to cultivate reflective leadership practices. Kate has just released her amazing second book, Metamorph, Transform Your Life and Leadership.
By the time I landed in the UK, we were one of the first Black African families at school, in the neighbourhood and where we lived. Everybody pretty much made sure that we knew that. I called her the night I had had this amazing, eye-opening, Jesus is the way moment. And I said to her, I've become a Christian. She said, Kate, do you know what you're doing? Do you know what you've done? She didn't speak to me for years. Sometimes there are people who can negate your identity and can undermine your identity, your sense of self, your sense of who you are and what you're capable of, what you're able to do. So I'm careful about my inner circle.
Was there any time where you ever felt I shouldn't be here and I should just fall back, not be, for want of a better word, pushing and trailblazing and breaking all these different glass ceilings that have been created for hundreds of years?
The short answer to that is
I am always curious, for someone who is very accomplished, who has done a lot in a lot of spaces, how do you introduce yourself when people come across you or people meet you?
There's a question. It depends on who I'm meeting. So it depends who I'm actually interacting with to begin with. So in some spaces, it's appropriate to use my title and to say, I'm Reverend Dr. Kate Coleman, because sometimes people come with a particular perspective of who I am because they see I'm a woman and etc. So sometimes that's the way that I do it. And sometimes I'm just Kate. Hi, I'm Kate. Let's sit down together. What's on your mind? So it depends.
Yeah. It's interesting that when you say that, people already have a perception about you. And I always navigate between identity. Identity is a really, really important topic that I talk about a lot. And I'm always curious, who do you allow to shape your identity? Is it the environment that you find yourself in, or does it something that comes from the inside? I know you talk about some of that in your book, which we'll delve into, but I'm curious from your perspective, how do you see identity?
You know what? Identity is shaped by all sorts of things. So, who people perceive us to be and who we perceive ourselves to be, I think comes from a number of different places. So yes, it definitely comes from the inside. It definitely comes from the internal journeys, the internal dialogues, the internal scripts that we develop over time. But it also comes from the people we move amongst, so the people we have around us also reflect back to us our understanding of ourselves, and sometimes they tell us more about us than we know about ourselves, so sometimes the people around us can see things in us that we can't see, and sometimes they can't, so this is where you kind of have to make some decisions about who you spend a lot of time with, because there are people who can negate your identity and can undermine your identity, your sense of self, your sense of who you are and what you're capable of, what you're able to do. So I'm careful about, my inner circle. I'm careful about those people who can speak into me, who I let everything down for and trust implicitly, whether they're bringing good news or bad news. So I think identity is shaped by so many things, and obviously, I'm a Christian, so I believe my identity is also shaped by God, and it's shaped in Christ for me. So there's a very clear faith dimension to my identity. So yeah, many things.
And thinking about that, let's go a little way back. Not that far back for you, but I want to go back to your younger years. When I say younger years, I'm like, let's say 0 to 10. What were you like then?
Was you should probably be asking somebody else that question. But in the absence of my mother, my father, or my uncles and aunts and all of that, I think I was leadery. Let me put it like that. From the age of about 5, I didn't know it. Nobody referred to it in that way. I was actually quite quiet. As a young child, I was quite considered. I had siblings, and they were generally all louder or, more in your face than I was. When I see pictures of myself as a child, I've always got slightly furrowed brow. People kind of say I look very serious and thoughtful, and I look at myself and think, my God, what on earth was she thinking at that age? But I think I was definitely very thoughtful. I love books. I used to bump into lampposts reading as a child, and apologizing because I wasn't paying attention. So yeah, I think I was a little bit bookish, but I was also thoughtful, but yeah, I was slightly terrorized as well. So that was also part of my childhood experience, 0 to 10.
Terrorized.
Yeah, well, I was born in Ghana, West Africa. So, I came to the UK via Nigeria very early in life. So, I was 4 years old, 3, 4, by the time I landed in the UK. And, we were one of the first Black African families, at school and in the neighbourhood and where we lived. And everybody pretty much made sure that we knew that. So I was teased a lot at school. And I was quiet. So I had to learn to find a way of expressing myself that would discourage others from teasing me, etc., etc. Let me tell you.
That's the most politically correct way. I've had someone describe it.
It leaves lots of room for the imagination. So it's kind of like they're thinking, what did she do? So.
Well, maybe she did it what? So she let them know. No, but it's quite interesting here. You say you were very leaderly from then, and then you then go on to talk about being quiet and being thoughtful. And I'll guess, and this is me inferring, that's even where that curiosity that you also talk about in your book was already there, birthed with the reading of books and everything else. And then coming into a new environment, you have to figure out how to navigate. So even speaking back to what we just say around identity, that there are times when our environment around us, whether we like it or not, begin to shape us in one way, shape or form, and shape our thoughts, our thought patterns. And obviously you navigating through normal secondary school, that kind of stuff, you wanted to then go and study like biochemistry and pharmacology. Was that like the dream of who you were going to step into before God woke you up and moved in a completely different direction? That went into...
Absolutely not. No, I mean, no. Story. I get to my secondary school. I go for an interview with my father, and I'm in the head teacher's office, probably one of the few white women head teachers around at the time. I didn't know that at the time, but I'm there. And so she asked me, so Kate, what do you want to be when you grow up? I'd given this a lot of thought, So I said, I want to be a poet. And she said she was kind of surprised, but my father was coughing in the background. He cleared his throat and he said, she wants to be a doctor. That's what he said. So, in those days, it was what was the West African trifecta. It's doctor, lawyer, engineer, and it's probably expanded a little bit these days. So, in his mind, that's what I wanted to be. So, the whole biochemistry pharmacology thing. One of my favorite teachers at school was a biochemist. I asked him, "What did you do?" And so that was a concession to my father. So it was kind of like, I really don't want to do medicine. So I'll do biochemistry and pharmacology. And he was kind of okay with that because it was still, biomedical sciences. So I know that wasn't part of my plan, but I'm glad I did it.
When you decided to then pivot, when you started, and obviously got your degree and then pivot into ministry, what was the reaction then?
From my father, he was not impressed with that at all. He was not impressed with that at all. So it was, and to be honest, I wasn't planning to head in that direction. I did settle into the biochemistry and the pharmacology, and I did get very interested in biomedical science, and I wanted to continue and go on into pharmacognosy, which is all about medicinal plants. And I wanted to head in that direction. I thought I might be able to do some good in Ghana particularly. But so the whole ending up in ministry was a big surprise to me, but my father was not at all impressed with that at all. That's where I landed. He when he came to this country, he wanted his children to, be one of the trifecta, to be doctors, lawyers, or engineers. And so stepping out of it in that way, particularly since he'd had a very difficult relationship with the UK church. So it was a big deal for him, and he didn't come to terms with it until many years later. My mother embraced it much quicker than he did.
That experience when you became a Christian, what happened for you and to you, shall I say, that just clicked and things begin to change or take a new form, a new light for you?
That's quite a story. So, I'm at university at this point. I'm actually actively trying to avoid Christians. I'd gone to a church school. So I was trying to avoid Christians, trying to avoid all the religious stuff. I lived in Camden, so spirituality everywhere, and I got there, and in my aversion, discovered that my best friend that I was going to lectures with was a Christian, but I did that almost by accident. So coming back from lectures one day, went to her, she invited me for coffee, went to her room, had lots of posters up, Jesus loves you, God is this, and I just thought, oh boy. I was a spiritual person, but really Christianity was not the thing for me. So I asked her, are you religious? And she said, no, I'm a Christian. I'd never heard anybody say that before. So it was like, oh, okay, what's this? And that kind of started the journey. And then within weeks, I had a Damascus Road experience with God. And it was one moment on, off, and then the next moment on. And it was a huge shift. And everybody who knew me was surprised that I'd taken this step. Just as an example, my best friend and I had been studying the Quran together, because her partner was Muslim. So we've been kind of looking at that. I've been looking at a whole bunch of other stuff, but we've been looking at that. I called her the night I'd had this Damascus Road moment, this amazing, eye-opening, Jesus is really the way moment. And I said to her, I've become a Christian. And she said, Kate, do you know what you're doing? Do you know what you've done? And she didn't speak to me for years after that. She put the phone down. She didn't speak to me for years. So I knew this thing cost. I knew it cost following Jesus, and taking this path. And that was the beginning of it. But yeah, so the cost has always been there. I've always been very aware that if you do this thing properly, if you're all in, which I don't know that there's any other way to do it, but if you're all in, it costs to follow Jesus. There is a cross, literally. There's a cross, and yeah, you have to reckon with that. You can lose friends. You can be misunderstood. You can be, all of this stuff goes with it. So I understood very early on that if I was taking this path, I needed to do it with my eyes open, but that God was with me, and that Jesus would give me the help that I needed to do whatever journey I needed to take.
That's it's powerful to hear, because I think in particular when people come to Christ earlier on, early days, it's always this, I just call it the fairy tale, that in a sense some people kind of think like, oh my gosh, I'm going to come in and everything's going to be great and life's going to be perfect now and I'm going to get everything I need and God's going to provide for me. And a lot of times the cost or the sacrifice that you might have to go through is not really spoken about that much or felt that much, especially in the early days. And when you do feel it, it's like, why am I coming and doing this? And you just kind of run away. But for you to feel that from your best friend, to feel that from like your dad, and feeling it in other ways that kind of expanded, and you still were so, I guess, more closer to God in a sense, and more locked into like, no, this is a calling and commitment I've made, and I understand the journey I'm going through. And you just kept on like, and for a better word, elevating all the way through, is quite powerful testament to hear from a young Christian. If I go way back to when you first kind of came to Christ and had that Damascus moment with him as well.
Yeah. I always think that I'm grateful. It was difficult. It was a difficult time. There's no other way to paint it. But it prepared me for the journey ahead. So it prepared me for breaking ground, for pioneering, for being first. It prepared me for those things, and I'm grateful to God that He saw fit to kind of create that kind of space where I could grasp that this is the cost of it. And yeah, I didn't have rose-tinted glasses about it. I always found it strange when people thought that following God or following Jesus would make everything, would kind of make your life, make you impervious to life. Life is life. Everybody lives on this planet, and life happens to us whether we're Christian believers or not. The issue is how we then deal with it, and whether we trust God in the midst of the stuff that happens. And from time to time, we see miracles, and I have seen enough miracles to know that they happen, they're real, but we're not immune to life. None of us.
Yeah, so true. Life is always going to happen. And I guess it's, do you want to go through life alone? Do you want to go through life believing and knowing that God is with you and guiding you? And He doesn't promise you an easy life, but He promises you an eternal one, but also that you're never going to be alone. And speaking about that difficulty that you talked about, you kind of navigated through your faith to obviously go on to become the first Black woman in the Baptist movement to kind of get ordained. And I remember in your book, you talked about men talking to you about like the clothes you should wear and all that kind of stuff and how that was even tough to deal with. Was there any time where you ever felt I shouldn't be here and I should just fall back and not be, for want of a better word, pushing and trailblazing and breaking all these different glass ceilings that have been created for hundreds of years, if you look at the institution?
Yeah, the short answer to that is no. The reason being, I didn't know that that was what was happening. So I didn't head into the ministry space thinking I'm going to break every glass ceiling or stained glass ceiling I find. I've moved into that space saying I want to honor God with the gifts and the capacities and the capabilities He's given me, and whatever it is God asks of me, I will do. So, as I said, I took it seriously. So I found myself in spaces being told, do you realize that you're the first? Had I known that, I might not have been so quick to get in there, because being the first is often very challenging. But once you're in the space, yes, of course, there were times when I was, you know what, this is too difficult, this is too hard. Why is it on every front? There's something to encounter, something to deal with, somebody's issues, all of that sort of stuff. But I was committed to trying to honor what I perceived to be God's call on my life, and then committed to honoring the gifts and capacities and capabilities I believed that God had given me. So that's, so I continued, I pressed on, and subsequently found myself as a first in lots of spaces.
Do you ever feel that as a weight or as a pressure on you? Especially if you look back from when you were doing it those days to now, has that shifted at all, or do you still carry that?
I mean, yes, of course, sometimes it is a weight and it is a pressure. In fact, the more you become aware of the unique space that you occupy, the more you become aware that you're the only Black person or you're the only woman in a space, or you're both of those things in a space. And the more you become aware of others who need you to create space so that they can find their place in a space, that places a bit of a weight on, for sure. But as I said, what I try to do is to say, well, what is it that God is asking of me? So I try not to wear that too heavily, but I am aware of it. And I realize that part of my task, part of the gift, is to create space for others who are coming behind me. I don't want anybody, and I've kind of conducted my leadership in this way in some ways. I don't want anybody to have to reinvent the wheel that I've had to invent, So it's kind of like, you know what, take the wheel I've invented because I happen to be a first in that space and improve on it. And don't go through all the stuff I had to go through. So I want to change the space in a way that makes it easy for them to change the space in the way they've been called to change it. I don't want them to have to change it in the same way I had to change it when I got there. So in that sense, I guess that's a bit of a way. But it's also the nature of the task. It's also the job. It's also the calling.
How do you know when, or how do you discern God's voice and speaking to you versus what can be human nature? Because when they just talked about you constantly go back to God and like, is this your will? let me know, and you did stepping forward. But I think it's always hard to me to know what is one, what is the other one. So how have you done it in your journey?
A lot of this stuff is practice. you know, um, well, sometimes there are kind of like three voices, aren't there? So there's your own voice, which sometimes you think that's God and it's not, and there's God's voice. And then there's everybody else's voice. And, you've got all of those, you've got those three things at work all the time. And listening for God's voice is a really interesting thing. So over time, over the years, I've become better at discerning between my voice, other people's voices, and God's voice. Because God's voice sounds a certain way, feels a certain way. And I've had some remarkably, the only way I can put it is very, sort of amazing moments hearing God's voice, where God made it very clear that he was speaking. But it's also been easy to get God's voice mixed up with my voice and to think, oh, that's God, and then to discover, no, it's not. Further down the line, but that's what learning is for. So there are no easy ways of doing this. Everybody wants the sort of the 2 steps or the 5 ways of. You create the environment, you learn to listen. And there's, the story of Elijah, so this guy is used to hearing from God through, it's fire, everything, fire falls whenever Elijah speaks or does something. It's some big thing. And then he finds himself in a space and ends up on a mountain, and there's an earthquake and a fire. And God's not in either of those things he might expect God to be in. And then there's a still small voice, and he realizes that God is in the still small voice. The thing I love about that story is, although he was used to big displays of God, he still recognized God's voice when it was a still small voice, and it wasn't this big display. So we get to a place where we just begin to recognize that's God, that's not me. But up until then, we have to deal with salt water, spring water, all of this stuff flowing at the same time and try and figure out, is that me? Is that God? Is that them? So, yeah.
And when I listen to you say that and using that example, there is a phrase that you use in your book called Living Parables. And you talk about how, like, something that you use in your business a lot, which like transforming difficulties into something good. And when I think about like Elijah's story, that's kind of what God did. He transformed something that was difficult turned into something good. And people might be listening to you right now, listening to some of your journeys of fun and thinking, how can I understand the living parables in my life when I might be navigating something and I want to understand the context of how that bad or what feels bad can actually be God at work and God moving through that particular incident.
Yeah. So yeah, we have lots of phrasing that we use that we found so helpful. Living parables being one of them. We have another phrase that we use that sometimes you'll be in a scenario where you'll be very aware of the blueprints of the enemy. So you'll be very aware that everything's crushing, everything's falling apart. But in every scenario, every space that we find ourselves, you'll always find the fingerprints of God. And so I would say, look for the fingerprints of God, because God is always there. It's not that God has devised the scenario to try to destroy us, but God will use whatever scenario we find ourselves in order to build us. So if we look for the fingerprints of God, we begin to discern what it is that God is doing in us despite what's happening around us or happening to us. And sometimes because of what's happening, So, so this is some of the stuff I've learned over the years that, and it's not that I want to revisit any of those things again. I really don't, I can assure you, but I can see the value of some of the journey. I can see the value of some of the difficulty. I can see the value of those boot prints of the enemy. But I can also see the growing. Look for the fingerprints of God, because God is always in wherever it is that you are, whatever's going on around you. God is up to something. God is doing something. Look for what God is doing. Look for what God is saying. Look for where God is in this thing that is difficult to navigate or difficult to live with or in. And then follow God's voice, follow God's leading in that. And sometimes it's the toughest places we hear God the clearest. And that's another thing that I've found. Yeah. So, those living parables for me have often been, I've been able to see myself in God's story. So another phrase we often use is that, who we are in God's story is as important as the story God is telling. And who we're becoming is as important as the story God is unraveling. So pay attention to those things. Pay attention to who you are and to what you're going through. Pay attention to who you're becoming, because God is doing something in all of that. He's not just telling a story for its own sake. You're in the story for a reason. Find out what you're in the story for and do it on purpose rather than doing it accidentally, which was a big part of my own learning. Yeah. So living parables is part of all of that.
When I hear you say that, it's interesting. I actually think your book in itself is a living parable. And the reason why I say that is a part that you write around when you started to put this all together, you were not in a great space. And it sounds very much like even through that journey, what you might have set out to write initially, God kind of changed all of that and gave you a whole different light to then birth what you ended up creating, which was an absolutely brilliant book. So even your book itself is a living parable, a living testament to what you just said as well.
Yeah. I 100%. I definitely started out one way, and in all of the challenge of the moment, because that season, 2022, just about everything that could go wrong went wrong. But in all of that, myself, my colleague, 5 major operations that year, never been in the hospital before, suddenly in for, goodness me, serious stuff, and bereavements, struggles, family stuff, work stuff, finance, all of everything. It was coming from every angle that year. But God got my attention in a way that might not have been possible at any other time. And of course, we weren't long out of George Floyd. And, there was all the stuff happening across, actually just not the Christian world, but across the whole leadership sphere, in terms of leaders getting called out for doing terrible things, often sexual misconduct, financial misconduct, all kinds of stuff. So all of that was happening. And I was rapidly growing very tired of a lot of things I was seeing happening around the church. And the churches, not any particular church, but the church as a whole. And so this whole, what has happened to transformation, the transformation of the individual being the basis for bringing transformation as a leader, what's happened to that? So yeah, so that was that year, 2022, was a catalyst for all of this stuff coming out. All the stuff I've been thinking of for years, stuff I've been praying about for years, all the stuff I'd been talking about for years suddenly came together. Metamorph is the result of that coming together. So yeah, it was quite a season.
That sounds both beautiful. You have the phrase like beautiful poetic. I would say that when I hear that phrase, it's like there's some pain behind that. That's why it's beautiful poetic. Like that's the only way you can just capture everything that you kind of gone through. But like I said, that's what life is, and being able to just slow down and listen, and then take the lessons from that is super important. And you mentioned like leaders just generally even in that space of time, but the work that you cross many boundaries and barriers because you're not just in church. You're in businesses, you're in charities, you're in the UN, so you're working in different spheres. How have you been able to bridge all these different worlds together and lead from a place and position of faith as well?
I recognize that all of those worlds are part of God's world. There is nowhere that God is not, and there's nowhere that leadership is not needed. And ultimately, leadership is leadership is leadership. So there are different technical skills and knowledge that you need in whichever sector or sphere you're part of. But the ability to lead people is an ability to lead people. And, there are commonalities regardless of where you are. So although many of my examples and stories and case studies and stuff like that, I pull from sort of ancient wisdom, biblical material or other stories, they're common to anybody who leads. So I just seem to have an ability to move across those sorts of spaces. And I'm very, very grateful for it. Similarly, within the church context, I seem to have an ability to work with, Anglo-Catholics all the way through to, Pentecostals of every shade and description. And I'm very grateful for that as well. Yeah.
Have you found it easy to shift the mindset of people who still believe in that traditional leadership model that you kind of talk about in your book, especially going back to you operating in so many different sectors? There's so much stuff that you see that you can pull in out. How have you been able to help people, if possible, shift their mindset from the typical traditional leadership way of showing up to what they need to do going forward? Because that's all changed as well.
Yeah, it's a really interesting thing to see that sometimes in leadership we can be addicted to particular kinds of behavior, particular ways of being. We think a particular way of operating is the best way to do it. And usually we just need an opportunity to touch base with to touch base and interrogate our values and who we are, who others see us as, and who we actually want to be. So no, it's not an easy thing to do for leaders, and not everybody's ready to take that sort of journey. But where there is an openness and a desire to lead well, then yes, I'm always ready just to help people to take that journey. But bearing in mind that we do get addicted to stuff, and it is very difficult to break habits, but it's not impossible. It is possible to take be engaged in a transformative journey of your own as you seek to transform around. And I think sometimes it's a leadership thing. If you're able to cast a vision, a better or tell a better story, or cast a better vision than the one that people have of leadership, then oftentimes people are open to yeah, actually, I would like that. I would want more of that. So, yeah.
So how do you know when a leader is open, ready, versus when it's just lip service or they're being made to do it because something's gone wrong and you're like, no, that person needs some help, you need to come in. How do you tell the difference between both?
Yeah. Well, there's some things I won't even head into. So when people have been made to do it, there's no good end to that story. There's no good end to that story. So, so yeah, some of it is if they're made to do it, you can cast a vision, help people to want something better. So, another phrase we sometimes use is, how can you give people salt? So how do you make them thirsty for something? So sometimes the task is giving people salt. So in terms of helping to develop them, but you do need to know when people are ready for a thing and when they're not. And sometimes you just have to say, actually, if I'm able to take 30 or 40% of this room with me, that's a critical point for this group or this organization. If I can take that many people with me, if they can want to make this shift, then that's fine. That's enough. You never win 100% of the room if it's like that. In terms of individuals, we do some of the same work, in terms of coaching and mentoring people. So you know if somebody's ready to take the journey, you know that they're open, you test the waters, you see how often they actually do the things that they themselves have said they believe they should be doing. So, as a coach, particularly as a mentor, I know that my task isn't to encourage people to become what I think they should become. My task is to hold people accountable to what they believe they should be doing. And if they are not accountable even to themselves, then they're not ready for this kind of journey. They say one week, oh, yeah, I really think, yeah. And then the next week or the next 2 weeks, they still haven't done any, or the next month, they still haven't done anything with that. Then I have to, draw some conclusions, that this is more talk than anything else. And I say, look, maybe we'll come back to this. We'll come back, but maybe not now.
I can very much, I can so resonate with that. If I got to the point where really earlier on in my contracts with my clients, I'm like, if you have a conversation and 3 times you don't do what you say you're going to do, I cancel the contract. So I'm like, I can't be wasting my time and yours. So that accountability is super important, but it's interesting how we as humans struggle with it. We struggle to hold ourselves accountable for something that we know would help us. And I guess it goes back to that point you make earlier on, that sometimes it's so easy because of what you know, whether it's right or wrong, it's just comfortable. So it's so easy just to stay in that lane and kind of keep on going down that path, even though changing will be pivotal and transformational, but it just feels a lot tougher than it can actually be sometimes as well.
Absolutely. And we are, I'm back in faith language. We are created for transformation, so everything about us from the point of birth to adulthood, we don't look the same as we did when we were babies. We're not even the same height, so we are created for this constant shift and change and transformation. We just don't always lean into it. We're made for growth. But sometimes we just say, no, thank you, not today. And we just have to undo that saying and say, actually, I was made for this. I can do this. And whether somebody is a person of faith or not, they can do that because we're made for it. But they do need the narratives that help them to take that journey.
And there's a quote that I took where he said, if you want to bring about change, you must be willing to adapt your own mindset and behaviors before seeking meaningful change elsewhere. And when you wrote that, that really, really stood out to me, because to this conversation, I think there are a lot of times we look at, or we want to change organization, we want to change our environment, and getting people to understand that, no, you also need to do that change. You need to model something. It's probably one of the toughest conversations to have with leaders. We're like, oh, I want to do this with my team. It's like, yeah, but what about you? Like, what are you? How are you part of that problem? And effectively, you change and then become part of the solution. And I was curious, how have you been able to help, I guess, leaders, generally speaking, people see themselves that they need to go through that personal transformation before proceeding into that global transformation?
Yeah, I mean, this again, this is very much part of the what I've written. It's very much part of this new book. So I start with identity before community, and community can be your team. It can be the whole work environment. It can be the people that you interact with in your neighborhood. And then I move to mission. And mission is what you're called to do and how you're called to do it. But identity is first. And for many leaders, they try to do change as if they're not part of it, as if they're sort of as if they're a potter, just molding this thing and trying to get everybody else to change, but they don't have to change. If you don't experience change, you don't know how to do change. Not really. You're doing something, but it's not transformation. It's not the kind of transformation that can change things forever. It might be many other things. So helping people to understand that what they lead might be out there, but where they lead from is in here. It's in their hearts. It's inside. It's their mindset. It's what they are, who they are. And that actually for other people watching leaders, because of course people are always watching leaders, even when leaders don't think they're being watched. For other people who are watching, your credibility rests on your ability to do the thing that you're expecting other people to do. So if you're asking for change out there in others, in your team, you need to model it. That the whole extent of your credibility rests on that. If you expect people to do what you say, but not what you do, then you've misunderstood leadership.
And is there a difference between change and transformation?
100%. So change is, transformation is a kind of change, but change is when something new starts. But transformation is when something old falls apart. So we often think of the things as the same thing, but it's not. For transformation to happen, my book is called Metamorph. It comes from the word metamorphosis. And when most people think about metamorphosis, they think of, caterpillars turning to butterflies. That's the idea. To get from a caterpillar to a butterfly is not just something new happening. Something old breaks up. The whole process of turning from a caterpillar to a butterfly, everything melts down, and then you end up in this pupa and you're a soup in there. And then you emerge this amazing thing. So that's the essence of transformation. Something looked, behaved, expressed itself in one way and grew to look, behave, express itself in a very, very different way. Change can happen like that. Transformation takes time.
I guess it's very much like a cocoon of a caterpillar going to a butterfly and going through that whole process. It takes time. And that's a point you made earlier on, that we kind of alluded to a number of times. When you think about the the essence, it sounds like, for what it is that you do, what your organization does. It's around that God-given gift and talent. And in your book, I think it was chapter 7, you talked about that Esther, leading on purpose and different things like that. And as I was reading, I was like, how do you help people, I guess both Christians and non-Christians, discover and embrace their purpose, so they kind of make decisions that are aligned to their identity, to who they are, who they've been made to be?
Yeah. So yeah, again, it's very much there in that Esther chapter, which is all about purposeful leadership, and really, I help people to get there through these 4 questions that come through in that chapter. And the first question is an identity question. So the first question is, why me? And then we go from why me to why here. What is your context? And we go from why here to why this. What is it you're doing? And then to why now. And that's all to do with the preparation. But getting into a place where you lead purposefully, where you lead in a way that you know when to say no, because it doesn't align with your purpose. When you know when to say yes, even if you're reticent or afraid or whatever, because it aligns with your purpose. And you know what you exist for. You know what you're doing here. And in any space at any one time. Is one of the most important questions, aside from the big existential question of, why do I exist? Purpose question is the next one. Why am I here? And why am I here in this space? And what difference can I make in this space? What can I bring to this space? And those 4 questions, why me, why here, why me, why this, why here, why now, help us to make sense of purpose. It's one of the processes, that 4-stage process that I will take leaders through to really understand what they're about.
And they are super powerful questions where if you look at them at face value, you're like, oh, those are simple, straightforward. But then when you actually no, take your time, think about it, it unravels so much. Sometimes very, very uncomfortably, because it forces you to go to spaces where you try to hide away and you definitely not wanted to go to, which is why they are such powerful, thought-provoking questions. And as I read them, it very much reminded me of, I guess, a running theme that's also throughout the book is the power of curiosity, that you need to be curious about yourself and your environment. But that power, that nature of curiosity is such a key skill that we all need to have as leaders. And I would say, I think it's also one that I think a lot of leaders find hard to do, especially when you're at the senior or at the top of the organization, because you're like, well, can I afford to be curious? Because there's a pressure, there's responsibility, there might be shareholders. And I actually think, yes, even more so you need to be. So I was curious to hear from your take, and obviously you talk about in the book as well, that power of curiosity. Why is it such an important skill that leaders in particular really need to hold on to?
Well, I mean, there are some fantastic examples. Unfortunately, no specific one comes to mind, but I've just been looking at a number historically of organizations that where their key leaders, whether they're CEOs or whether they're senior leadership team, just failed to have the kind of curiosity they needed to have, say, around their context. Many of those organizations do not exist any longer. So something as simple as that. You need to be curious, particularly the more senior that you get. You need to be curious about the people you work with. You need to be curious about the environment in which you operate. You need to be curious about who you are as a leader and who you need to be. You need to be curious about how you are as a leader and how your leaders are. So to fail at curiosity is the baseline of leadership for me, in my understanding. To fail at curiosity, particularly in this age, in this era, where there is so much change going on, where there is so much ferment and there is such great diversification, to fail at curiosity, to not be curious about those things and about how they can enable you to do the work you do and to do it well, is to fail as a leader. You know, eventually it catches up with you, as history shows us, with so many organizations and leaders who just didn't go there. We don't lead in closed systems. You know, they are systems that are open and that are in flux and in flow all the time. And it's not that we can be curious about everything, but we can set the tone for curiosity and be curious about the things we need to be curious about, depending on where we sit in an organization, so that we can bring our learning into the decision-making spaces that we inhabit. If we don't do that, then we end up like Kodak. There's an example that comes to mind, you know, or Nokia, you know, or, you know, we end up like that. So, yeah.
Speaking of curiosity, I am curious. How have you managed to sustain a friendship and run a business together for 25 plus years with Cham, co-founder in Next Leadership? Like that, for me, I was like, that's a long time. And you talk about it because of how you're both also very different personalities, but yet you somehow make it work. And I come across like a lot of co-founders who struggle to get along for like a couple of months, let alone like the length of time that you both have been doing this together. So what are some tips that you can share with people who are navigating that co-founder journey?
Okay, so yeah, absolutely right. We've had a remarkable journey, an amazing friendship. We think it's God-given, so obviously that adds a dimension. But we're back to curiosity again with this. You have to be convinced of the value of the relationship and the friendship and of what it can bring back to you. Myself and Cham, we're so different that I know that she will cover the areas where I have blind spots or where I don't see. She will see into those areas. And I have to be, even though, you know, every now and again, it's frustrating when somebody doesn't do a thing in the way that you do it. You know, who doesn't want that to happen? Who doesn't want a mini-me? That's what often happens with leadership. But being able to see the value of the diversity, first of all, just having somebody who's different, who thinks differently, who behaves differently, who will interpret something differently, and what that can bring into the business relationship or the organizational relationship moving forward, what that insight can bring. So be convinced of that, first thing. Keep it real, you know. So just speak your truth, let them speak their truth, you know. Just be open and honest and cultivate that. Make that the culture. So that you're actually able, there are no holds barred in a sense. You're able to say whatever it is and know that you're not pressing any red button that's going to blow up the relationship or blow up the business. That actually this is the way we do things. We are open and honest and frank. That just makes it so much easier. It means that you're not using energy trying to creep around somebody, you know, tread on eggshells or any of that sort of stuff. You're not using valuable energy you need to use to be creative. So keep it real would be another Another thing. And also, it's not supposed to be easy necessarily. It's just supposed to be possible, So create a new narrative for yourself, So rather than thinking, why isn't this easier? Just say, wow, actually, the fact that we're still doing this and we're in this is amazing. It's not going to be easy. They're different. I'm different. They probably get as much frustration sometimes as I do. But actually, isn't this amazing? We're modeling something. So have a narrative around what it is that this partnership, this relationship is designed to do. And by engaging, interacting, people are always amazed at Cham and myself, because we are literally very, very different. Everything we do differently. There are a few areas of overlap, but we just have a very, very tight friendship. I know she will tell me the bad news as well as the good news, but she won't be trying to kill me in the process, She'll tell me the bad news because she cares about who I am and who I'm becoming. And I want that. I don't want somebody who's just going to tell me what I want to hear. I can tell myself that. I can do that for myself. I don't need anybody else to do that for me. So yeah, I hope that, those are a few things that come immediately to mind.
Those are super, super helpful, actually. And I think it's important to, what you said around that, the story that you tell yourself about what their relationship is all about is really, really key. And having your friendship, your values, and your faith at the core of everything else, and then shaping everything else around that, sounds like it's been quite fundamental for your growth and just being real with each other. I think we see play out in boardrooms all the time where people nod in their heads and then you start having the meeting after the meeting after the meeting. But the ability to just be real shows the depth of a relationship and how much trust there is there, because that it's not a safe and malicious place. And this person just saying so and you're aware of. So I really love those examples, those tips. I think they're really transformational for people who are listening, for sure. And as we come to, unfortunately, the end of this conversation, Kate's a very, very busy woman. My last question to you is, how do you define leadership?
Yeah, there's a definition for every definition. There are a whole bunch of things that leaders do, clearly. But for me, leadership is, as a person of faith, leadership is the ability to partner with God in whatever God is doing in this earth. Whatever is U-shaped that God is doing in this earth. So I always say to Christian leaders in particular, but it applies to other leaders of faith, you remember that you are never in the first chair. You are always in the second chair. You're always following. So for me, as a Christian, I'm always following. I know my task ultimately isn't to make it up as I go along, even though I do that from time to time. But my task is to watch what Jesus is doing, to watch what God is doing, and how and where God wants to bring something that's kingdom shaped, something that's beautiful, something that helps communities to flourish and people to flourish into the space. And then the question is, well, what's my role in that? What's my task in that? Who am I in that? But I'm always in the second chair. I'm always following. God is in the first. Jesus is in the first chair. So he takes the lead. I follow. In the words of Jesus, when, he walked this earth, he said, I only do what I see the Father doing. And I try to live by that principle in my understanding of leadership. So I'm leading for sure, but I am in the second chair. I'm following my leader.
Wow. That's wow. What a way to end this conversation, and what a way to even think about leadership. And one of the things that why I keep re-emphasize around those of you listening to get the book is there are times personally I feel like a lot of leadership books come from such a westernized lens and view, and you just break through all of that and you capture so many different things, so many different cultures and narratives and approaches, bridging the multiple worlds together, the faith element in there, the business element in there, the church element in there, bringing biblical stories to life, but also real life stories of people that you've mentored and walked with throughout. And it really sparks that introspective thought that I think so many people need and crave in one way, shape, or form. That this is why I highly recommend the book, and it'll be available. Information about it will be in the show notes. Information about Kate and Charm and their organization. Again, if you want to work with them, will be available for you. Highly recommend it as well. But I just want to say thank you. Thank you for your time. Thank you for coming on. Thank you for having this conversation that I have thoroughly enjoyed.
I've loved it. Thank you. Thank you for having me. And thank you to all those who have listened and hopefully have been inspired and encouraged.
Sure they would have been. This is Everyday Leadership. We will see you all next week.